Hello and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our Global Director and the Business Line Leader for our Medical and Laboratory Business at Intertek. And today I am so thrilled to be joined by Mike Lynch from our Medical Assurance team. Hi, Mike. How are you doing?
Good, Clarissa. How about yourself?
I am so good and so happy to have you here. This really is a delight. So before we dive into our topic at hand for today, maybe you can just give everybody a brief introduction to yourself, kind of how you got to be in the medical field and where you are now.
Sure. Well, I've been doing medical devices going back to 1981, so it's a few years, and kind of stumbled into it. Grew up in the Detroit area. My dad worked for the auto companies, and I watched the economy go up and down and said, medical's pretty solid. People are always going to need care, and health is critical to everyone. And but also I was a frustrated, wanted to be a doctor, but then was really an engineer. And so that's how I kind of stumbled into it. Worked for a lot of big companies and small companies, and actually worked for Intertek 2015 through 2021, and then took a little time off, and now I'm back as a consultant trying to help people.
Yes, and so happy to have you back for sure. And obviously, you've been in the industry for a long time, so you have such a wide range of knowledge and different topics and projects and things that you've worked on. So I'm really excited to talk about our topic today, which of course I think is on the forefront of everyone's minds, medical and otherwise, which is AI, right? Artificial intelligence and how it's impacting the medical device industry. I know we've talked a little bit about it coming off of CES when I was there with, all of the focus on digital health and AI, and, more recently being at the AIMI Nexus conference with the FDA and some of the discussions on AI. We're just really seeing it starting to take hold and infiltrate the medical industry. And I think, obviously ChatGPT has just made everyone aware of AI, right? It came on the scene, and now everyone is talking about AI or using AI or thinking about how they can use AI and other of those types of programs, really just coming off of this whole ChatGPT kind of revolution. So if you look at ChatGPT and kind of what we're seeing with those principles, how does that relate to what we're seeing in the medical devices industry using AI and software? Like what are we seeing? What do you see as, the impact of this on the med industry?
Well, of course, ChatGPT and some of those other tools that are public facing garner a lot of attention from the media and everything. And, their principles of operation are very similar to what medical device companies have been using for quite a while. I go back quite a while, and back in the 80s, neural networks were just coming to the forefront as an artificial intelligence. But in those days, a piece of hardware to run a neural network cost you $50,000 to $100,000. So you didn't put them on every desktop.
Mm-hmm.
But today, we have cloud out there, so you can get a lot of computing power at a very low cost. We also have phones that are as capable as a $50,000 workstation was years ago. And so you're seeing it come back around. Now, the big area, what we've seen in terms of AI development has been around image-based data. So if you think of X-rays, MRIs, CT, anything that's image-based, what you can do is you collect those images, and then you can curate the images. The physicians can actually say, oh, I know that this image came from patient X, and patient X ended up with this diagnosis, or this is how we treated it, and this was the outcome, and things of that nature. And so people have been developing tools to, especially in radiology, they've been developing tools using AI and machine learning and neural networks to help supplement the radiologist. So right now, worldwide, there's a shortage of radiologists to actually read all of the X-rays and the MRIs and everything. And so by developing these tools, they can actually reduce the workload. So you just go in and you train the tool once or many times out of thousands of images, but it's a curated data and tied in. And then future images can come in and be assessed by the tool. And then the radiologist has to look at it and say, yeah, I can confirm that this is what I'm expecting. During COVID, we saw a lot of activity in this area because you had so many people coming in with respiratory distress. And it was like the hospitals couldn't deal with it. And so they were developing tools very quickly to take a look at an x-ray and say, okay, based on this x-ray, how do we triage this patient? Do we put them into intensive care immediately? Do we send them home with antibiotics? What do we do? And so, you saw a lot of development really come very quickly. The real AI stuff started all the way back in like 2003. The FDA was looking at it. People were submitting PMA-based products where they weren't disclosed to the public. But what went crazy was in about 2017 to 2019, the number of clinical papers about artificial intelligence in radiology doubled. It just like went exponential.
Yeah.
So a lot of people doing research, the research was coming out. And then, of course, we hit 2020 with COVID and 2021, and it continued to be a real big issue. There are a lot of devices on the market that use AI. The FDA publishes a listing. It's a combination of their database as well as some other data sources. And so it lists out all of the devices that they think are AI-based. And over 85% of those devices are radiology devices.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's where the big focus has been.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting too, right? When you think about being able to categorize and take all of these images, or the other kind of applications of the ways that they have been talking about using AI is, for a doctor to be able to take all of the information gathered from a meeting with a patient, right? And so you have images that are all collected, you have all of this data that's all collected. It can really be used in a powerful way. But I think it's really important, as you noted, right, to remember that this isn't exactly new to the medical industry, right? I mean, we've seen this as a slow growing application, and now it's just kind of exploding all over. As you say, right, you can go to the FDA's website, you can see all of the different types of radiology products and things that are already kind of approved as AI type devices. So I do think that it's important for people to remember, right, we're not reinventing the wheel here necessarily. It's just now this technology is moving really fast and obviously can be used in a lot of different applications. So outside of what we're seeing in radiology or some of these traditional uses, are there other ways that you're seeing AI being used in medical devices, or other things that you're hearing about, applications in other types of products or devices?
Yeah, so I mean, there are cleared devices, either through de novo or through 510K. One of them is for the diagnosis of diabetic retinopathy. So they actually take an image of the retina through a camera, like when you go get your eyes examined. And then they've collected those images and they tag it all together. And so they've actually got products out there now that based on that image, they can give you a diagnosis. Similar, people have been looking at colon cancer and now have diagnostics. So video endoscopes have been out there since the 80s, and they can collect images as they go through the lower intestine. And when they identify a polyp and take a picture of it, and then they can do a biopsy and verify that it's cancerous or not. So they've been collecting images for many, many years and have a lot of good correlations. And so now they're teaching how to use AI to basically identify cancerous polyps in the colon. So those are image-based, but then there's non-image-based devices that are coming out. Good example is a lot of activity in the diagnostic cardiology using ECG. Now, a lot of people are familiar with the Apple iWatch, which is one of the early devices for actually taking ECG and then doing a diagnosis of, let's say, atrial fibrillation. So that's one of the big ones. And then there's also electronic stethoscopes where they teach the stethoscope to hear heart sounds and then they can do diagnosis. It used to be just the really good cardiologist could do that. Now, anybody with an electronic stethoscope and AI program can sit down and say, oh, you've got mitral valve regurgitation. And then big area is glucose monitors and operation of insulin pumps. So the glucose monitors, the measurement of glucose, at least today's CGMs, is through interstitial fluid. And so it's not a direct measure of blood glucose. And in some cases, people are using AI to help manage the correlations because they watch things oscillate and fluctuate, and then they use the AI to interpret for that specific patient what they expect both the current blood glucose to be and what the future blood glucose, how's it trend. And likewise for the insulin pumps, they'll take a look at that data coming in, and then they use the AI to massage it through a set of algorithms and make sure that they don't overdose or underdose the patient with their insulin. So those are the big areas. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's 87% of the products on the market today are radiology, but then the balance are coming out of 4 different groups or 6 different groups. And, so there are a few percentage points each.
Yeah, it was interesting too. So as I mentioned, when I was at this conference the other week, right, manufacturers were bringing up some of their concerns. So in this space, right, of, what is your subset population that you're then basing these decisions off of, right? So obviously with AI, we know that even with a ChatGPT style tool, right, where it's like, oh, this data is only relevant up to 2021, or if you only have data on, this certain type of population and are making predictive assumptions off of that because that's the data that you've collected, right? So it was just interesting to hear some of the concerns as you're talking about right now. We see all these different product types where they're starting to have this element of AI that they can incorporate into these devices. But to hear manufacturers' concerns of, hey, well, how can you guarantee, the population that has been studied or where you're gathering these images from, and if they're representative of, every single type patient or just a certain type of patient, right? Or how do you prevent an algorithm from kind of going off on its own and making some of its own assumptions or kind of outrunning itself? So it's curious to kind of watch the 2 pathways, right? Seeing manufacturers moving forward and getting really excited about incorporating AI, but then also having, some reticence, right? Some concern because there's so much that's unknown, right? So it's just interesting to see what the industry is having to say too, as this is kind of moving forward fast and kind of at the forefront of everyone's mind.
No, and it does present a challenge. Okay, how do you validate a product? We've even seen recent on a mature product like pulse oximetry. The FDA just put out a note that, hey, pulse oximetry isn't as accurate on Black people as it is on white people. And it's like, okay, so what happened when they did the clinicals and they developed the algorithm? Didn't they sample the population broaden? Same thing with artificial intelligence. You have to make sure that the data on which the product is being trained is representative of the population in question. And is the data well curated? Meaning, do you have good traceability between that data that's going in as the input to the machine learning and then the diagnosis that's coming out of it? And how accurate is that? And is it good? I like to tell the story, was reading about AI. They took did a quick study in just a hospital, and they wanted to see if they could correlate X-rays with the probability of pneumonia. And so what they did is they had, of course, X-rays being done in the X-ray suite, high resolution, really good X-ray, get the patient in there. And then they had X-rays being done with the C-arm because the patient was too ill to move to the X-ray suite, so they just bring the C-arm to them. Well, they ran the AI, and as they did their assessment, it was like, okay, so the thing was very accurate on prediction of pneumonia, but what was it that was driving it? This is where transparency of the AI algorithm comes in. And when they dug down and they looked at the factors that the AI program was working on, it was the low resolution of the mobile C-arm that gave the prediction and the correlation. So it wasn't anything within the X-ray itself. It was just the resolution, higher probability that the person that was too sick to go to the X-ray would have pneumonia.
Yeah, well, there you go.
And so, like anything else, like all computers, garbage in, garbage out.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to be careful on it. The challenge for both manufacturers and for the regulatory bodies is to be able to assess how good or what's the quality of the training data. And then is the test data the same, or is it a subset, or is it removed? And how do they do that? And so there is a lot of guidance out there, and there have been people that have been developing AI products and AI technology for a number of years that can direct you in the right place. You just don't go out and buy a copy of TensorFlow and start, coding. But it is, it's still a challenge to make sure that you've identified the population in question and whether you have the correct input data to your.
Yeah. I think that's so interesting too, right? Because even as of recently, right, we know that like women are far understudied, right, in studies of medical devices and medications, right? So same thing, right? When you're trying to find making, some sort of prediction using AI, and it's like you have to study all different types of population, the people who are going to be using either the device or the drug or whatever it might be. So it's I think super relevant discussion at this time. The other thing that manufacturers brought up a bunch, which of course everyone's always concerned about, is, what is the FDA thinking about these AI type products, right? What are they saying? Where's their stand on AI type devices? And it was interesting because at one of the conferences that I was at, the FDA was like, well, can you tell me what your algorithm's going to do? Like, if you can't, how do you expect us to regulate it, right? So it's just a kind of funny place where we're in right now. So what do we think about what the FDA is saying, or what the FDA is standing with these types of devices? Obviously, we know they've approved some in the AI space, but are we seeing them putting out, guidances or requirements or things like that specifically to the US market?
Yeah, so I know that the FDA since like 2015 has had it on their radar that machine learning is coming. And in 2018, because they were dealing with the Apple iWatch and some other manufacturers who weren't traditional medical device, but wanted to do medical device, they introduced what they called their pre-certification model, where basically, although it wasn't really a medical device, if they were applying appropriate controls and things of that nature, they could let that manufacturer actually develop it as a medical device. And so that was kind of the start. And then in 2019, they put out their first, it was like a white paper. It was a proposed regulatory framework for artificial intelligence-based software. And so that was really a stake in the ground for the FDA to say, okay, here's where we think we're going to go. There was also other activity, BSI, Amy, other people were getting involved in developing standards or positions on artificial intelligence in medical devices. And then throughout 2019, 2020, 2021, FDA held a bunch of public hearings and workshops. They attended a lot of workshops. I saw them at the Xavier workshop, and they followed it up in 2021 with a communication titled Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning Software, their action plan. And that action plan described what they intend to do over the next 5 to 7 years to better regulate artificial intelligence and kind of put a stake in the ground. And then they followed that up in late October 2021 with a joint document called Good Machine Learning Practice, GMLP. And that was a joint effort with the UK's Ministry of Health as well as Health Canada. And those three regulatory agencies collaborated on that. And I think, that'll follow through. Eventually, that'll end up being, with some modifications, potentially an IMDRF document or something that's, chosen as a best practice worldwide. And then in 2022, the FDA issued a final guidance on clinical performance assessment for computer-assisted detection devices in radiology. So that was them taking a look at all the products that had come through and then laying down, okay, here's what we expect to have in a submission for a computer-assisted radiology. And that's whether or not it uses artificial intelligence or it's a fixed algorithm, but it was good guidance that came out. It had come out initially as a draft, and then they finalized it 2022. And that told people that, okay, here's our stake in the ground. If you're going to make a submission on a radiology type device, here's the information you have to provide. And then in 2023, they basically issued one of the first guidances off their action plan, and it was what they call the PCCP, which is a predetermined change control plan. And it was telling people that if you're going to do AI and you think you're going to have that AI evolve, so maybe you start out with a diagnostic tool and over time you collect additional data. Well, you don't want to have to go back in and do a whole resubmission and say, okay, I've increased the precision of it. But what the FDA has allowed is they say, give me a predetermined change control plan. How are you going to have this device evolve and get better? And then if I believe you're really going to follow through on it, you don't have to do a resubmission. I might check in with you, but you don't have to do a resubmission. And so that guidance came out in 2023, and that's got a lot of people thinking about, okay, how do I position my AI device? How do I plan for future changes or improvements on its
Yeah.
potential?
Yeah, and I think, the idea behind not trying to take AI and fit it into your device just because you want to use AI, right? It's like, what is the intent? What is the purpose, right? So having a plan and how it's going to iterate going forward, right? And how it's going to improve and knowing what you're doing, right? I think sometimes people get really excited about like, oh, let's figure out a way to incorporate AI. And it's like, is it needed? How are you going to use it? And then what is your plan going forward, right? I think it's so important to think about rather than just because, everyone's utilizing AI or, now AI is just on the brain everywhere, right? So it is interesting just to hear, both from the regulator side, kind of what they're saying, what they're seeing, and then also from the manufacturer side and just kind of where this all converges. Talking about IMDRF too, which I think, we've seen from a medical industry standpoint, right? Really trying to bring the regulators together, come up with, uniform, unified ways, more cohesive, harmonized ways of looking at things, especially in some of these areas like AI. We know there's regulations in the EU. Like, what are we seeing with what's happening for AI? Because sometimes, of course, the EU can be ahead of some of the other countries too, with the regulation standpoint. So, are we seeing different things that the EU is doing? Are they jumping on board with some of the stuff that we're seeing with IMDRF? Like, what are we seeing specifically?
Well, so the EU has been developing legislation around AI. They're, of course, they were the first ones out with the GDPR, personal data. And so they're very protective of their constituents. And so they introduced a proposed regulation, thought it was going to pass last year, but they pulled it back in, but it's being revised, and good chance that it'll get approved and implemented this year. Now, this would apply to all AI, not just medical devices, but all AI would go through a notified body to make sure, and it's risk-based. Okay, so the AI that polishes your shoes not going to have the same level of scrutiny as AI in a medical device, or even AI at an airport that identifies your face and says, "Yeah, you can
Yeah.
go through the pre-check things." So they are underway with that. The U.S. being a completely different economy and also a different legislative mindset, is a little bit behind or taking a different pathway. It's more, good guidance. I mean, we've got some legislation and some best practices and some executive orders. Our main thing is we feel that we are the world leader in AI technology, and we don't want to lose that. Of course, China and Russia would both disagree, but we're going to try to keep that going. And so in 2019, President Trump issued the executive order maintaining American leadership in AI. And then in 2020, the AI Initiative Act passed Congress, and there was been a bunch of activity in that area. And then in October 2022, the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights was published. That's a framework that identified by the White House that kind of guides out what we're going to do to make AI safe and secure in the U.S. And so from a legislative point of view, we're still that country that allows free market to rule, and we're not going to dictate it. But at the same time, we don't want to end up creating problems that we wish we hadn't allowed to come to. And so that's going on here, going on in Europe. Worldwide, you're seeing different initiatives. It's not as transparent, places like China. But you're also seeing that some of the more socialized countries are taking Europe's example and starting to implement controls around AI just to protect the people so that they're not taken advantage of. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't want to be talking to GP chat and think you're talking to your doctor.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's a big concern. Exactly. Yeah. So true. Well, Mike, this is a topic I could talk about forever. I just find it so fascinating. I think obviously, we've seen a lot of changes recently and they're coming rapid at us, in medical and in all areas of our lives, just as consumers, right? What is AI going to mean in the next 12 months, less 24 months? So it's a really interesting topic, especially as it relates to medical devices. So love chatting with you about this. Is there anything, that you would say to manufacturers who are starting to think about AI or have been using AI and maybe curious about, where they should be looking for guidance, is it just really going to IMDRF, FDA, and just sticking with those? If there anything else or things that you would share as, manufacturers are starting to move forward in this journey?
Well, there are a lot of standards being put forth. IEEE has a bunch of standards on development of AI products. IEC has come out with some new standards. I would say review the standards because they're going to give you some best practices. As a medical device manufacturer, I would also, if I think I'm heading in the direction of an AI-based device, I would figure out whether I've got a predicate or whether I'm going to end up going the de novo pathway. And then I would get together with the FDA as early as possible, do a Q-sub, and talk to them about their expectations for validation. Had a number of people, think that they could get away with very small sample sizes. And like we were talking about, the population that you're going to evaluate, if you want to sell something for the general whole population of the United States, you've got to take a look at all the different demographic groups. And we're a very diverse population with differences, depending on the modality of that product. You have to consider, okay, how can it be affected? And so it's very important that you sit down. The FDA has some really sharp people with good experience. They'll give you good feedback. They'll also tell you, if you're barking up the wrong tree
Yeah.
on a product, or if you're heading in a direction that's going to make you a PMA and it's not possible to be a class 2 device. So
Yeah, I think that's such good advice. And I think too, when we think about, helping to propel the industry forward, right? So when we have an agency like the FDA in the US who's really wanting to be collaborative, it's like, that's the only way that we can all as an industry, right, learn more about what these technologies can do, is having those discussions early. It helps the FDA. So when they see other products, right, it helps the manufacturers, and then it really helps to form, all of these guidances and all of these requirements going forward. So I think it's such a good piece of advice, right? They want to be collaborating with manufacturers, right? They want to have insight into what people are working on and what's going on in the industry. So I think that's a great piece of advice. And as I said, we could talk about this all day, and I'm sure we'll have much more to talk about in the future as we see new AI developments in healthcare and in medical devices. So really appreciate your time today, and such a great discussion. And of course, if anyone has questions or wants to talk about it with us further, they can reach out. So thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you, Clarissa. That was a great,
Have a good one.
great discussion.
Yeah, have a good one. Thanks.
You too. Bye-bye.